So now we have the other side of the coin, and Edward is going to discuss the possibility of universal concepts, and particularly universal concept of knowledge.
All right, thanks for staying for the last lecture of this amazing workshop so far. And so I'm going in some ways to give the counterpart lecture from the lecture Steve just gave, to some extent anyway. It's the first time ever I'm going to give a talk while sitting, and I've given hundreds of talks in my life. I feel it's very strange, so forgive me, the mind is embodied, they say, and I think I've always been skeptical, but I think there's a grain of truth now that I have to sit here while lecturing, so forgive me about that. So what I want to be talking to you is why, if it's true that there's such a thing as something like a universal concept of knowledge, what its function could be. Right? So that's going to be the topic of this lecture. How could we know, and what could the function of this concept be? Now, why should we believe that there might well be a universal concept of knowledge? I agree with everything that Steve said. What I'm going to be my starting point is, in a sense, Steve at the end of his lecture, Steve raises question about why we are not yet, and maybe for a very long time, but at the very least, we're not yet in a position to assert with great confidence that there is such a thing as a universal concept of knowledge, and I agree with that. I think I entirely agree with that claim, both for the philosophical reasons and for the empirical reasons. But Steve ends up with two possible options. It could be that the universality thesis or something like that is right, and Steve is betting that it might be more likely to be wrong, and it is exploring the philosophical consequences of its falsehood. What I want to do is I want to assume that something like the university thesis is right, and then I want to sketch a research program assuming that something like that is right. So, but let me first give you some reason to believe that something like the university thesis is right. So by that I mean, in most and maybe all languages, we're going to find a lexical expression that is a rough translation of to know that in English, savoir que in French, and so on and so forth. By rough translation is that some of the users that are used by everyday speakers in English, in French, in Spanish, are also going to be found in these other languages. Not all of them, right? But many of, at least some of these users, and maybe many of these users. So here are some reasons to believe that at least something along this line might well be true. And that's a work that Steve already mentioned, and rightly discussed earlier. That's a work by Wierzbicka and Godard. So Wierzbicka and Godard make various claims. They got the empirical basis of their work. And the empirical basis of their work is to look at a few dozen languages and to identify what they call linguistic frames, which are typical way of using various linguistic expressions, including linguistic frames for knowing that and their translations in other languages. And one of the claims they make is that a subset of the linguistic frames for knowing that are found in every language. That's, let's say, the empirical basis of their claim. Then there's a more theoretical basis. From that, they infer that there's a universal concept of knowledge, which was this question about concept individuation, what it means to have the same concept, and so on and so forth. I want to bracket this second question. Is that the same concept? How much similarity between users? Do you need to have the same concept? I do believe these questions are anyway very fraught from a philosophical point of view. What matters for me is the idea that what they've provided us with some evidence, far from being complete for the reasons Steve sketched out earlier, but there's some evidence that some linguistic frames, some ways of using to know, savoir que in French, and so on and so forth, across languages are quite similar to one another. And that's at least give us a reason to at least entertain some version of the universality hypothesis. When you look to developmental psychology in English, you also find that the concept that in English is expressed by to know develops very early. In fact, it's found more commonly, and it predates the use of to think in English. It emerges as early as I want or I desire in English, meaning around 18 months, 20 months, children already start using I know. And it's usually in the contrast between I know and I don't know. I know and I'm ignorant of, something like that. And in fact, there is a fairly well mapped development from 24 months to 4-year-old of knowledge ascription. So at 2 years, children already use know on a regular basis. They use it to express a state that contrasts with ignorance, and also they use I don't know to express ignorance. When they're 3, they are going to use I know that, and they're going to have a that clause with a proposition. When they are 4, the evidence coming from John Hopkins, but mostly the work of Rachel Dudley, suggests that at least some of their users in English are factive. Now, just like Steve, I do not believe that every use of, I think that's what maybe Steve's opinion, but I don't believe that every use of to know in English is factive. I think there's plenty of counter-examples to that. But I think there are also factive users of to know in English. And you find these factive users in children as early as 4-year-old. Now, here the data are quite limited from a cross-linguistic and cross-cultural point of view. It's simply data with English children, English-speaking children, American children mostly. But still, the fact it's an early developing concept maybe gives us a reason to flag out that it's similar to those other concepts that seem to emerge very early on in the life of children. And as I've said in other contexts, it's also a concept that seems to be very, very important. So there are aspects of cognition that really depends on the concept of knowledge. Morality and the law depends on ascription of, at least in some contexts, not others, but in some contexts of ascription of mens rea. And as a result, on the assessment of what other agents happen to be knowing. There's a large form of religion, such as, for example, what anthropologists of religions call big gods, that characterize a specific form of religion as all-knowing gods. And of course, you can't have this concept of an all-knowing God if you don't have the concept of knowledge. So the concept of knowledge is central to other aspects of human cognition. So here's, I think, a bunch of interesting pieces. None of them is very conclusive, but I think all of them are interesting enough to entertain the idea that some form of the university thesis may well be on the right track. Concept we find across languages, similar users. It developed very early on in life, a fairly robust form of development. It's used in other areas of cognition. That has led me and somewhat puzzlingly Steve, as one of my co-authors, to at least hypothesize in some of our papers that there might well be, and I think that's the right formulation, there might well be a core folk epistemology. And by which I mean, anyway, a set of epistemic principles and concepts, maybe the concept of knowledge, or I think maybe concepts of knowledge, so ways of thinking about a specific epistemic state that are similar to one another across culture, that's found across culture and that develops reliably during development. Now, that hypothesis is perfectly compatible with a tremendous amount of variation across cultures and across languages, right? In the same way, to say that, for example, that theory of mind is a core domain, it's found across cultures and developed reliably, is perfectly compatible with assuming that the details, and it's often more than the details in the ascription of mental states to oneself and others, vary across cultures and languages. So universal and variation always coexist with one another, right? So arguing there's a core folk epistemology, a set of shared principles and concepts, is perfectly compatible with acknowledging tremendous differences in those concepts, in the way these concepts, for example, get to be deployed. And we could have various models for understanding this articulation of universality and variation in the domain of folk epistemology, exactly as we have such models elsewhere. Now, I will not argue more for the university thesis or some form of the university thesis. What I want to do, as I said earlier, is just take it for granted. Let's assume that there's some good reason to take it for granted. And then I think that would be indeed a surprising fact. I think that's something that Steve hinted in his lectures. If it's true, that would be really quite surprising. And then that would raise the question, well, why do we have this set of epistemic principles and concepts that are found across languages and cultures? One way to answer this question is to ask a functionalist question, is to ask what is a function of these principles and concepts? And I want to ask this question just for the concept of knowledge. Supposing that there is a universal concept of knowledge or concepts of knowledge that are sufficiently similar to one another to be put in roughly the same ballpark, what is their function? Why do we have this or those concept? So that's a question I want to be addressing in this talk. I won't give an answer to that question because it's a question that's way too big for a one-hour lecture. And in a sense, I view the Geography of Philosophy project as, in part, trying to provide us some evidence that's going to be helpful to address this question. What I want to do is sketch a research program and tell you how we can try to make progress in answering that question. So the way I will do it is I will lay out three functionalist hypotheses, so three hypotheses about the concept of knowledge. Then I will ask, well, once we have these three hypotheses, how would we go about testing them? And I will describe a research program for testing these hypotheses. And then I will suggest that the type of work that we've been doing now for 10 years, namely cross-cultural experimental epistemology, gives you a proof of concept that this research program is actually doable. That's going to be the basic gist of this lecture. So let's start with the three functional hypotheses. And here I'm taking my cue from a very classic book in analytic epistemology and a more recent version of this book. The classic book is the one on the right, Edward Craig's book, Knowledge and the State of Nature, and a more recent book that is, in a sense, a more modern version of Craig's book by Michael Hannon. What Craig and more recently Hannon do is try to understand what they take to be patterns of knowledge ascription in a functionalist framework. They try to make sense of the way we deploy the concept of knowledge by looking at what the concept of knowledge does for us. And I want to take a cue from this research project. And I think Craig is putting the gist of his research program extremely well at the beginning of his book. Here's what Craig says. There is such a thing as a point of this concept, by which he means the concept of knowledge, what it does for us, the role it plays in our lives. And if it is so, one way to find out must be to form some hypothesis about it, try to work out how a concept custom designed for that role would look like. Anyway, and then see to what extent it matches our everyday practice with the concept of knowledge as actually found. Craig, in this quotation, is making three claims. The first thing he's telling us is that the concept of knowledge has a function. Right? That in itself is controversial. If you know a little bit of the recent literature on conceptual engineering, there's actually a lively debate about whether it makes sense to ascribe function to concepts at all. One of the leading philosophers working on conceptual engineering, Kaplan, thank you very much, my external memory, Herman Kaplan actually denies that that concepts have a function, right? So I'm going to, so that's the first claim. So it's meaningful to talk of the function of concept. The second thing Craig tells us here is that it tells us, well, if you want to study, it gives us a methodology to study those functions. And its methodology has two parts. The first part is a theoretical part, formulates functionalist hypotheses, and the second part is test those functionalist hypotheses. So I will not say anything about the first claim. I will take for granted that it's meaningful from a philosophical point of view to ascribe function to concepts. Debatable. We can come back to that question in the Q&A. But I will just focus on the second part of the quotation. If concepts have a function, we want to know what this function is, and the right methodology is to start by formulating functionalist hypotheses. Now, if you've read Craig's book, that's clearly a place where he's failing, because instead of formulating a bunch of hypotheses and try to see what they predict, he endorses a single hypothesis, and he tries to make sense of everything he finds in light of the only hypothesis that came to his mind. Michael Hannon, great book, but suffers, I think, from exactly the same flaw. I think a better strategy is, well, let's be a bit more imaginative. Let's think about various functionalist hypotheses about the concept of knowledge, and then from that, let's try to derive some prediction. So what I want to do first in the first section is to lay out at least 3 functionalist hypotheses. I'm not claiming to be exhaustive. There are other hypotheses one can come up with, but at least I think they cover a fair amount of ground. And I think the way I'm thinking about that is to draw first a distinction between knowledge as a tool for knowledge in the context of communication and knowledge independently of communication, right? So one might think that the reason why we have a concept of knowledge has something to do with communication, with the fact that we exchange information with one another, right? Or one might think, no, so the reason why we have the concept of knowledge has nothing to do with communication. If you believe it has something to do with communication, if we were not social species, we would not have the concept of knowledge. Right? If you believe, no, the concept of knowledge has nothing to do with communication, if we are asocial creatures, we might still have the concept of knowledge. Right? Now, let's suppose that the first hypothesis is the right one. The reason why we have the concept of knowledge has something to do with communication. Then, when you exchange information, you can be a buyer or a seller of information. Right? When you buy information, other people have information you want, and you want to get that information from them. Or you can have the information yourself, and you can sell them to other people. You can see I'm a teacher. I sell information to my students. I don't get much money out of that. My students pay to get some information from me. They pay a lot of money to get information from me, but somehow it goes to someone else. Anyway, so in the context of knowledge understood in the context of communication, it could be from the perspective of the buyer or the perspective of the seller. Right? And that gives us 3 ways of thinking about the function of the concept of knowledge. So that's what I want to do next. I want to spell out these 3 ways of thinking about the function of the concept of knowledge, starting from this somewhat principled way of thinking about what the concept of knowledge does for us. And notice that this type of framework is really what's missing from both Craig and I think Hannon's recent work. They just don't have a theoretical background that just tells us how to identify the function of the concept of knowledge. So let's start with the first idea. I'll start with assessing testimony, then granting testimony, then tracking the identification of fact. So let's start with the first functionalist hypothesis. So you assume that the point of the concept of knowledge has something to do with communication, and you focus on the buyer, on the person who is acquiring information from other people. On that view, the main function of the concept of knowledge is to identify trustworthy sources of information. Right? So that's one of the reasons why we might have a concept of knowledge, because it might be very helpful to identify people among people in our environment, among people from which we could get information, those that are trustworthy sources of information. So when you say, John knows that blah, 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 what you're really meaning is that John is a trustworthy source of information about blah, blah, blah. So you're flagging out someone as someone from which you can get that form of information. When you say John does not know, you're just flagging that person as an untrustworthy source of information with respect to a given proposition. And that's indeed the way Craig himself thinks about the function of the concept of knowledge. Here's a quotation from Craig where he says, the concept of knowledge is used to flag approved sources of information. That's one of the things the concept of knowledge could do for us. Sort out from whom to get information and whom not to get information from. And I think that makes a lot of sense why the concept of knowledge could have this function. In a market of information, so you might think that information is free, but information isn't quite free, actually. We are trading information often for respect, for deference. Sometimes we're even paying for it, except when we are giving lectures, somehow we're giving our information. But anyway, in the market of information, where you've got sellers and buyers, it's important for a buyer, for someone who is going to pay something to get information, to sort out competent on the one hand and honest on the other hand. So that's two dimensions that are quite independent from one another. Competent and honest from incompetent and dishonest sellers. And the concept of knowledge might help you do exactly that. So that could be one of the first functions of the concept of knowledge. All right, that's a first hypothesis. What the concept of knowledge does for you is flag out trustworthy source of information. Trustworthy means competent and honest. Another hypothesis still ties the concept of knowledge to communication, but from the perspective of the seller. Here, you're not trying to get information, you're trying to sell information. And on that view, the main function of the concept of knowledge is to offer a guarantee to others about what the world is like. It's a bit of a jargon, but roughly the idea is that when I tell you, I know that P, what I'm really telling you is, trust me, P, right? So I know blah, blah, blah. Well, blah, blah, trust me, blah, blah, blah. Give me some money, and I'll tell you more. So I'm actually offering you, I'm committing myself to the quality of the information I am giving you. And again, this hypothesis is not quite new. Austin, one of the great philosophers of language of the second half of the 20th century, had that to say about the function of the concept of knowledge. Here's what Austin says: when I say I know, I give others my word. I give others my authority for saying that S is P, right? So, and again here, it makes a lot of sense if you think about the concept of knowledge in the context of communication. Again, if you think that communication is mostly a matter of selling and buying, if you are a seller, you are competing with other sellers, and you must have a way to flag out the quality of the product you're selling, and to commit yourself to advertise and also to take responsibility for the information you're providing. That's why sometimes you say, I think that P. When you say, I think that or I believe that, you are actually withdrawing some of the responsibility you would otherwise take on by saying, I know that P. All right, that's the second function, right? First function is about communicating and you want to buy information. Second function is about communicating and you want to sell information. The third function has nothing to do with communication. Even if we were like asocial species, we would still need the concept of knowledge. And here, the function of the concept of knowledge is to flag out people in creatures or people in my environment that have detected some facts and that may act on them, right? So here's the idea. When I say X knows that P, what I really mean is X has detected some fact, and X would be successful if she acted on the assumption that P. Right? So X would be a successful agent. Right? And when you say X does not know that P, you just say that X has not detected that P, and as a result, is unable to act on the assumptions that P. John Turi, in a recent paper, maybe in the Epistemology for the Rest of the World, the book that Steve co-edited, has that to say about the concept of knowledge. The knowledge concept is not a human creation. Instead, the knowledge concept is an integral part of the primate social cognitive system which humans inherited. The core of the knowledge concept is truth detection and retention. Its origin is related to the basic needs for predicting other organisms' behavior to guide decision making. So why do we have this concept? Because it's very important to be able not only to predict other behavior, but to predict others successful behavior. When I ascribe knowledge to you, I ascribe to you a specific relation between your mind and the world. I say you have detected something in the world. And that allows me to predict not only the way you're going to behave, but the consequences of the behavior, the way you're going to have a successful behavior. And why is that important? Well, because it allows me to manipulate you. It allows me also to coordinate myself with you. And following Thury, one might think that it's the classic work by Hare, where you have a dominant primate and a subordinate primate, which are exposed to two different objects in your visual field, is an example where the concept of knowledge is useful, right? Being able to say, for example, that the dominant primate doesn't know, being able to say that the dominant primate knows that there is food here allows the subordinate to successfully predict the behavior, to predict the successful behavior of the dominant. Being able to say that the dominant does not know that there is food here allows also the subordinate to coordinate or to actually act in the right way in that situation. On that way, the concept of knowledge really has nothing to do with communication. It's just a matter of being able to predict other animals' behavior. Anyway, the main thing here is that it's at least three possible functionalist hypotheses. They're clearly different from one another. And the question then is, well, which of these three hypotheses, if any, of course, is the right one? And to answer this question, we need to go back to Craig's quotation. I already commented on the first and second part of the quotation. Let me say a few words about the third part of the quotation. In the third part of the quotation, Craig gives us a methodology to test functional hypotheses. And this methodology is very simple. You have a function about a concept, and you try to see what it implies for the use of that concept in everyday circumstances. And then you look at these predictions about concept use with the actual deployment of the concept. Here's the way it's supposed to work. What is that? Oh, come on, you're an American, you're not supposed to say. No, only Americans know that thing. Non-Americans, what is that? So I didn't know that as a French.
Trust me.
Yes, that man knows. So the first time I came to the US, I saw that stuff. I was like, what could it be? Okay, well, how would you know? I think is a better question. Well, how would you know? You have to formulate hypotheses about what it does. Once you formulate a hypothesis about what it does, you can say, well, if it does that, then you would predict this and that, right? You would predict such and such feature. So you could say, well, maybe it's meant to cut tomatoes. After all, it's right that stuff could cut tomatoes. But then why does it have that to cut tomatoes? That's kind of strange, right? Does not make sense of this feature. And then you say, well, it's meant to cut. It's an avocado slicer. And then it all makes sense. It's an avocado slicer because with that you could get rid of the whatever the core, however that's called. And then with that you can nicely slice. So that's just an example of how we go about testing functionalist hypotheses. We've got a weird thing. We make predictions about its function. From that we derive the features it should have. And once we've done that, we can look at, well, does it really have the features it should have if it's an avocado slicer? Well, that's what the geography of philosophy is about. Do avocado slicing, do a functionalist explanation maybe for the concept of knowledge. At least that's one of the idea behind it. And how to do that now? How to test functionalist hypotheses in the right way? How to test it wrong is to do what Craig did. So what Craig did is he formulates one hypothesis and then tries to fit everything under his hypothesis and just assumes that whatever his opinions about the use of the concept of knowledge really reflects the way the concept of knowledge happens to be used. And he does what analytic philosophers have been doing for decades now. He makes up facts about the use of the concept of knowledge by everyday speakers. And it talks again, it's a great example of someone who thinks the concept of knowledge in English is the concept of knowledge. So I think rather than doing that, we should do Craig meets experimental philosophy, where instead of just taking our sense of what the users of the concept of knowledge are, we should actually study them, and we should study them empirically. Now, there's two different ways of doing experimental philosophy. You can do M-Turk experimental philosophy, where what you're going to be doing is study the concept of knowledge empirically, but in English, and with M-Turkers, right? So it's a bit like doing analytic philosophy, except you run surveys instead of really doing empirical work. Now, it's associated with some universities in the US, but I won't say more than that, some Ivy Leagues, actually. What we're suggesting of doing is replace M-Turk philosophy with cross-cultural experimental philosophy, where, in fact, what we want to do is look, or I think what I want to do is look, instead of talking for both everyone in this project, is look at how the concept of knowledge or the word knowledge and its translations across languages are used to try to test, try to identify universal users of the word knowledge and their translation, so as to maybe inform some of the functionalist hypotheses that I've been sketching out earlier. We did some of that to some extent in the original project that Steve already mentioned, Intellectual Humility and Cultural Diversity in Philosophy, where we collected data for some things about knowledge ascription in 23 countries, 17 languages, in a range of places, mostly educated participants. One way of thinking about what we're doing, not the only way, as we've seen earlier, but one way of doing thinking about what we're doing is that we're collecting data that may be relevant to understand universal users, if any. Again, it's an empirical question, if any, that are going to be useful to understand the function of the concept of knowledge that might be part of a core folk epistemology. And as you know, we're doing that in these areas of the world. Now, one way of doing that, and that's, I think it's imperfect in various respects, I'll comment on that in a minute, is to think about what epistemic properties should, and I explain what that means, should knowledge ascribers, so people who ascribe knowledge, be sensitive to if a particular functionalist hypothesis is true. So let's say if the first functionalist hypothesis is true, right? If the point of the concept of knowledge is to flag out trustworthy sources of information, when you ascribe knowledge to someone, what should you be sensitive to? What aspect of this person's situation should you be sensitive to, right? And the hope is that the various functionalist hypotheses will make different predictions about the epistemic properties that people should be sensitive to. So what I've been trying to do in this talk and in versions of this talk is to look at various aspects of various properties that people could be sensitive to if one of these functionalist hypotheses is true. So what we have here is the three functionalist hypotheses. The function of concept is to assess testimony. The function of concept is to guarantee one's testimony. The function of concept is to identify people who have detected facts. And then you can say, well, if that's a function of concept, when you ascribe knowledge, should you be sensitive to whether knowledge ascription is reliable? Should you be sensitive to whether knowledge ascription is what philosophers call safe? By safe, it's roughly, could you have been easily wrong, for example? Could you have knowledge if you got it right by luck? Does the evidence that you have, does it entail the truth of the proposition that is a complement of knowledge? Does it require belief? If you know something, do you really need to believe it in some sense? And do stakes matter? I'll explain what that means in a minute. And so what you can try to do, I won't do it in great detail here, but what you can try to do, for example, is for each of these hypotheses, specify a set of predictions, right? So say, well, if that's the first function, you would predict that pattern of knowledge ascription. You would predict that knowledge ascription is sensitive to the reliability of the process by which an agent forms her belief, whether the knowledge is safe, whether it's acquired by luck or not, and so on and so forth. And you would distinguish the three functionalist hypotheses this way. Now, one of the shortcomings here that relates to, I think, Clark's first talk this morning is that all of these properties here come from analytic philosophy, right? So they're very much, we Westerners, and actually we, a very peculiar group of Westerners with a very specific training. So it might be that, the very hypotheses, the very properties that are here are way too limited, in fact, that we should probably extend them much more. But what I want to give you today is a proof of concept, is a type of hypothesis, type of research that could be done. All right, so I won't have the time to talk about all these prediction tables, but I just want to focus on two possible columns of this table. I will focus on the idea that for all the three functions of concept, for all the three functionalist hypotheses, knowledge is incompatible with luck. Right? So if any of these hypotheses is right, then if you've acquired a true belief by luck, then you don't know it. Right? And then I'll focus on stakes. And here the idea is how much is at stake for the person who has a belief should influence knowledge ascription. So let me just explain what that means. Let's imagine you have to submit, you're just finishing the draft of a dissertation for your PhD. And choose solution, and for example, you're about to give it to your advisor, and you know that if there is typos in it, your advisor is going to be very happy and could even send you back, and you might actually you might not be given your PhD, for example. And you check only once. What's at stake here is extremely high, right? If you leave some typo, then you're not going to be given your PhD. Now you read it once, you don't see any typo. Do you know that there are no typo in the dissertation? Now, contrast that with another situation where instead of giving it to your advisor, you're just giving it to your mom. And your mom will be a bit disappointed if she finds a typo in it. She says, my son, my daughter, she could do better, for God's sake, leaving typo. But, it's not that much at stake, If your mom is a bit disappointed, well, okay, fine, she's a bit disappointed. And you check only once, and you find no typo. And in that case, do you know that there are no typo? If stakes matter, then you should be differentially willing to ascribe knowledge in the two situations, right? As the stakes go up, you should be less likely to ascribe knowledge because it would be very costly to make a mistake in that situation. Right? So that's the very idea that stakes might matter for the ascription of knowledge. Now, so that's these two properties here. Can you get knowledge by luck? Do stakes matter for knowledge ascription? And the idea is that, I'm running a bit out of time, but the idea is that the three views here predict that luck, in fact, is incompatible with the ascription of knowledge, right? So if someone gets her belief by luck, or true belief by luck, you're not really going to trust her, right? You're not going to pay something. If you see someone that's, there's a lucky aspect in the way she forms her belief, you're probably not going to buy her information, right? If you yourself, there's a lucky aspect in which you form your own belief, you're not going to advertise yourself as being knowable, because then you're going to be punished in case you are actually mistaken. And then if you see an animal or if you see another human being just getting her belief by luck, it's quite unlikely that she's detected the fact, right? So in all these cases, you might think that information about the lucky nature of the way an organism formed her belief would defeat the ascription of knowledge. Now, in this case, text should not matter if testimony is a function of knowledge, is to assess testimony or to guarantee testimony, because in both cases, what's at stake is about the knowledge. What's at stake is for the knowledge ascribee, right? In my example about the dissertation, right? What the stakes are for the person to whom knowledge is ascribed, the knowledge ascribee, right? If I say I know there's no typo, I'm the one to which knowledge is ascribed. But here, what matters is for knowledge ascriber, right? So the stake here should not be really relevant if that's a function of the concept of knowledge. By contrast, here, if you think the point of the concept of knowledge is to decide when an organism is really entitled to act, does it have ground to act, then you might think that stakes should actually be more likely to matter. So you might think, for example, that stakes here is more likely to be an important property for knowledge ascription than it is there. There's more to be said about these predictions, but for the sake of time, I will leave it here. Now, once you've done that, you can do some cross-cultural experimental philosophy to test these hypotheses. And indeed, you can see whether, for example, across cultures, acquiring a belief by luck defeats the knowledge status of this belief. So indeed, philosophers have long been concerned with that question. There's a famous philosophical experiment called the Gettier case. I guess many of you are familiar with that case that is meant to test, so to speak, whether or not when someone forms a true belief by luck, that person knows the relevant proposition. And in a bunch of paper with Steve and other people, we've tried to look at whether in a range of culture and a range of languages, there's at least a set of cases where luck defeats the ascription of knowledge. Since I'm running a little bit short of time, I won't go in the detail, but in one of the first studies, we gave people 2 Gettier cases. Roughly, one of the Gettier cases works this way. Someone is very worried that his wife is late. He called one hospital, and the person at the hospital told him, your wife, whatever her name is, so your wife, Mary Jones, is at the hospital. So he forms the belief that Mary Jones is at the hospital. It's a true belief. Mary Jones is at an hospital, but just not this one, another one, right? So the person in the vignette, in the case, has a true belief, but it's true mostly by luck. Everybody got the case, or should I do it again? Yeah? All right, good. And then we ask people to ascribe knowledge in that situation and others. So what we found is that all over the world, when you give people a clear instance of knowledge, people do ascribe knowledge. All over the world, when you give people a situation where the agent has a false belief, people deny knowledge. Well, all over the world, in the 4 countries we look at in that study. And when you look at Gettier cases, we ask the question in 2 different ways, but for at least one way of asking the question, what you see in that in the 4 cultures we're looking at, namely the USA, Brazil, India, and Japan, people are denying that the agent has knowledge in this situation, meaning that in that case, forming a true belief just by luck, right, based on misleading evidence, is sufficient to defeat the knowledge status of that belief. We've extended that research to a bunch of other countries, and as you can see, it's a fairly stable result. So the only exception which is worth investigating further are the Bedouin in Israel, where we find actually that people there, at least in our data set, don't seem to think that luck defeats the ascription of knowledge. not sure what to think of that. It might be a false negative, or it might be actually a true result. And if it's a true result, that would be really fascinating. But elsewhere, notice, for at least one of the way of asking the question, you have a very stable result that when you form a true belief by luck, even if you've got good reason to hold your belief, people don't want to ascribe knowledge. People don't want to ascribe knowledge to you. Right? Now, it's only with industrialized participants, so we don't know at all whether you would find a very similar pattern with non-industrialized participants. So I think it's too early to tell. But at least it does suggest that it might be an aspect of core epistemology, that there's one epistemic concept that I want to call the concept of knowledge, that you can't be ascribed knowledge, or however you call it, if you form your belief by luck. And that's, as I said, compatible with the three hypotheses we started with. There's much more to be said on the matter, and that's one of the things we hope to do in the Geography of Philosophy project as part of Study 3, is to look at variation between types of Gettier cases. Because John Turi and colleagues have shown that even with speakers of English, there's variation among, and meaningful variations among Gettier cases. So it's not luck versus not luck. It really depends on what type of luck is at play here. Some luck defeats knowledge description, other forms of luck don't. Right. So that's a subtlety that is worth examining also across languages. We have no data about that so far. All right. What about stakes? Is knowledge description sensitive to the stakes? And I explained what that meant, how costly it would be for the knowledge holder to fail to know, for the putative knowledge holder to fail to know. And I've very quickly said, and really explained in great detail why, that those two functionalist hypotheses predict that stakes should not matter, and this one maybe predicts that stakes should matter. And in a paper just published in News, David Rose, me, Steve, and a bunch of, indeed, 40 plus other people have examined the question using some very well-known thought experiments from philosophy. And as you can see, nowhere in the world do stakes matter. Right? So philosophers have been repeating now for 2 decades, or maybe a decade and a half, that stakes is an important aspect of knowledge ascription. Many philosophers, not all anyway. But what you can see is that, in fact, for lay speakers across languages, stakes don't seem to matter. Here, a very short parenthesis. Again, that's one of the limitations of this past work that relates to some of the concerns that Clark expressed this morning. So we took some of these vignettes from philosophy, and while they, at least for philosophers, they seem extremely straightforward, I could have 20 of them for breakfast and still very, just in great shape. I think for many non-philosophers, they're kind of complicated, hard to make sure people really understand the facts the same way. More important, hard to make sure that the readers don't import facts in their understanding of the situation. That's a caveat for the past research that has been done. Now, supposing our data hold, then what we have is stakes don't matter, consistent with the two functionalist hypothesis that relate the function of the concept of knowledge to communication, but perhaps inconsistent with the idea that the function of the concept of knowledge is to identify organisms in my environment that have detected facts and that would be successful if they acted on their information. So it might be that this functionalist hypothesis about the concept of knowledge is actually mistaken. All right, I think it's time to conclude this lecture. Again, what I wanted to give you here isn't the final word on the matter. What I wanted to do is to sketch a research program about how, supposing that there is such a thing as a core folk epistemology, and again, that might be just a mistaken hypothesis. I'm just taking that as an assumption for the purpose of this talk. But supposing that as there is a core folk biology, a core theory of mind, there might well be a core folk epistemology. So supposing there is that, I think the next question, because it will be such a surprising fact, is what is the function of the epistemic concepts we have? And I think we want to try to answer this question in a systematic manner by taking our cues from a systematic framework about what the concept of knowledge would be, thinking about communication, what we do when we exchange information in a communicative setting, for example. Once we formulated functionalist hypotheses, and maybe we want to go beyond the 3 I've presented here today, we want to try, and I'm not saying it's an easy task, actually, I want to highlight the fact that relating these functionalist hypotheses with those predictions here is very arduous and quite uncertain. But supposing it can be done, we want to try to derive predictions about the patterns of users we would be observing if any of these hypotheses is true. And then what we want to do is to go about testing them, testing the predictions we would expecting if one of these hypotheses is on the right track. What I've been wanted to do is actually by giving you the results of 2 sets of cross-cultural and cross-linguistic studies I've done in the past. Both are flawed. They only look at educated people. They use fairly complex scenarios, but that is interesting. At least I wanted to give you a proof of concept that that project can be done. I mean, the answer, much work remains to be done to do it well and to do it at all, really. But at least I believe it can be done. So stay tuned for hopefully some of the results of the GPPs that are going to bear on that question. Here is a subset of the people I should acknowledge for the past work, not the GPP, but for the humility project. I would like to thank also the Templeton Foundation, which is funding this research, as well as the research in the humility project. And I'd like to thank you.